Excellent. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our rhythm of weekly meetings. Um, it was lovely to be last week in person. We'll pick it up here on Zoom. Um, we have an agenda. It's online. Why don't I share my screen with it, and we'll walk through that quickly, make sure we're all on the same page with this. As is our habit, we're going to start in addition to our housekeeping at the top, we'll do written public, whatever's come in over the transom since our last meeting. Liz Amler can give us a quick update on what's there. It's obviously all online for folks to look at in depth. The first hour and 20 minutes of discussion time, we're going to do this work on edits to the chapters. And this is kind of, if you think about it, it's a bonker balls thing where we've got a full council doing edits on, many chapters. Very challenging. However, the steering committee has prepped you up to do this work. We've got a punch list of things we want to look at. A couple things have come in since I published that punch list over the weekend. So it's the punch list plus a few things that have come in over email since. We're going to have to be extra efficient to do that. Let's see how it goes. We'll take a break, public comment at 12:30. And then our consultants will be back to do a presentation of scenarios model. And Jane, they have a scenarios analysis to present. Is that correct? Okay, awesome. All right. And then we need to save the last 20 minutes to go over the latest version of the draft priority actions. You'll see I sent over the weekend and it's posted up on the webpage. A new update that takes in all of our comments and the suggestions and the to-do items from last Monday, tries to put those and track change in the document. Also, it includes our top 10 at the top of the document and updated preamble language that was worked on with a number of you over last week. So we just want to make sure that we are very close to being locked in on that, as good as we can get it. So we'll take the last 20 minutes to do that and then talk about the next steps of really getting all of this over the finish line in the next 2 weeks. That's our agenda. A quick caveat on the agenda. I mentioned this at the steering committee meeting. Jane is going to take over facilitating after the break through the scenarios models, and I'll be back at 1:35. I just need to step out for an hour, and Jane will be in charge of facilitation of the public comment and of the scenarios modeling. Any questions on the agenda before we dive into it? Okay. Our goal is to get as close as possible to the chapters that are posted on the web page right now, as close as possible to feeling like we either have stuff resolved or we have a very clear pathway of getting it resolved with people being like, oh yeah, so-and-so and so-and-so, just go off and fix it and it'll be fine. That's what I hope happens here. Okay. Minutes are posted from our January 2nd meeting. They are detailed. If you're ready to, if you need more time, it's okay to say, you know what, let's do them next week. I think they got posted Friday or something. Does anybody want a little more time on the minutes from our last meeting? You can click right through this agenda and look at them. It's okay to say I need more time. Okay. Are there any concerns about the minutes from our last meeting? Okay. All right. Well, without hearing requests for more time or concerns, let's treat those as approved. Thanks, everybody. All right. Liz Amler, are you on deck to say what we've gotten in for public comment since we last met?
Yep. So we've received 2 written public comments since we last met. The first is resident from Roxbury wrote in focusing on the inclusion of agroforestry and traditional ecological knowledge in the climate plan. She advocated for explicit integration of agroforestry to diversify crops, increase food and income sources, and enhance tree cover. Also emphasize the need for specific and respectful inclusion of traditional ecological knowledge, urging the formation of partnerships with knowledgeable collaborators who should be involved throughout the process and compensated for their contributions, and also found the current draft thorough. The second comment expressed interest over Vermont's climate plan, describing it as unwieldy and unlikely to be implemented effectively. He highlighted the missed opportunity for the EPA's climate pollution reduction grant, and suggests simplifying the approach by focusing on straightforward programs such as providing heat pumps, given Vermont's limited budget and resources. And advocates for the practical solutions in a small state with limited population and resources. Those were the two comments.
Thanks, Liz. And as all comments that come in, they're posted online. Very easy to get to them on the How to Get Involved tab on the website. Okay, great. All right, so unless folks have anything else from the comments side of things, let's dive into our punch list of issues around chapters. Let me just say a word about what has happened if you're just joining in on this story of the chapter language. There's been versions of chapters circulating since March. They've been updated in different ways. And thanks chapter writers for continually responding to feedback and greater clarity about the structure. The steering committee met last Wednesday, last week, and did a nice job of flagging issues that are quite easy to resolve and basically can be, clicked through, and some other things that require or would benefit from your conversation as a full council. The punch list that I sent around over the weekend is a reflection of these issues that likely will benefit from full council conversation. Chapter authors like Rich have done really heroic efforts to take in comments from different folks who have provided them and create consolidated new drafts. So I'm really grateful for Rich and others who have invested that kind of time. Let me share on the screen the punch list, and it's available on the website as well for those of you tuning in. Let me just get back to that. I'll open up the most recent one that's on the website. There it is. Okay. Seems a little small. Maybe I'll make it bigger. Okay, so here's what, and this really comes from the consolidation of comments that came in from A&R and the Public Service Department and others. There's some other things that came in. There's one at the bottom here about health. And then you'll notice here, I've created another bucket of stuff that issues that feel pretty resolved or are in the pathway to resolved by the steering committee, just for visibility, like things that are happening. But we're not really going to spend time on these unless somebody feels like extremely strongly about something here that they want to bring it up. Jane, jump in.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to provide additional context, David, around these chapters versus the remaining chapters that are still out there. Just acknowledging that we had this bifurcated sort of dates with respect to the writing, in that there were these two consolidated suites of chapters being put forward. One that were the early writing, which many of these that we're now talking about in detail came in early March. And we've been focused on the recommendations and haven't gone back to these in a substantive way with you all to approve them. But those chapters can largely be described as the sort of contextual setting the foundation chapters around like the why are we writing a climate action plan chapters, and then the chapters that set up the recommendations. So the chapters that are supposed to be the context to lead a reader into the rationale behind why the priority recommendations are what they are. And then there are still chapters, and I just wanted to say this, which is why I raised my hand, that are still coming, likely really at the end of this week, for us to talk about next week. And many of those are going to be, contentious is the wrong word, but likely harbor places for the council to lean in and really discuss about tone and intention. And those are chapters that still remain, including the executive summary, the scientific underpinning, which is really sort of now Jared and Brian are working on like one chapter that talks about the modeling that you're all going to receive today. And then the chapter around the priority recommendations, which hopefully won't be too contentious because the basis of that is really this preamble language David's been negotiating with many of you. And so just wanted to flag that this is all in large part the writing for the climate action plan, but not all of it. And maybe at the end of today's meeting, for the next steps part on the agenda, David, we can show the slide for next week, which does sort of piece out what's coming for next week, and reflect on how and what the timeline looks like for how the council is going to talk about those chapters, because that's not very clear yet also. And some of those are really important.
Thanks, Jane. That's really helpful context. Yeah, so many words. And I think it's
Many words.
important.
I
You
can't
know,
hear you, David, if you're talking.
oh, really? Can folks hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
I can.
maybe it's a speaker thing, Billy, for you. I'm not sure. Okay. Um, all right, so that's helpful context. Our goal today is to see if we can I I don't want to wordsmith in the idea of like, oh, we're going to write it exactly this way. What I want is some directional nod from the council to say, leave it in or leave it in with a little bit of a modification, and then send off steering committee members or other people to go fix it, right? Because we won't be able to actually make real-time edits and documents right now. We're going to have to just give a directional nod, and with a little trust that with that nod, folks can go off and fix it in the way that feels right for the largest number of you. That's our goal today. I'm going to leave this up for the moment as we go through it. I don't have a better way in mind than just working our way. I also want to note there was an email that went around from Carrick with another piece that's not in this bullet list on another document. And so that's on my internal list here is what Carrick sent around. So that's one more bullet for us to get through. Okay.
David, before we start, can I just ask a clarifying question? I had also sent some emails on Friday with some suggested edits on an Ag and Eco chapter and on the was one of the summary chapters in terms of work that has happened since the first climate action plan. So
Progress and assessment chapter. Yeah, the chapter. Yeah.
Okay. Let's do, if you think those warrant council discussion, let's put them, let's see if we can get to them as well.
yeah, I'm not suggesting it now. I just want to make sure they're part of the list. Yeah, if we get to them, if not, they might just be very straightforward things that don't require discussion.
Okay, great. Yeah, I've not reviewed those actually, Jared. So I'm glad you mentioned those.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. So, Rich, you're going to be a key player in helping walk through some of this because you were trying to reconcile a bunch of comments. These bullets, most of them are in the cross-sector mitigation stuff, right? And it's an area where we've been negotiating within that preamble language, and we've landed in some good places there. We can take some of the spirit of that preamble language and help us make these decisions in the chapters. This is an overarching chapter that sits on top of the buildings and thermal, electricity and transportation and the non-energy ones. So I thought we'd start there. There's a couple things you'll see where it's like there was a suggestion to take it out. And then there's a question of like, actually, we'd like to leave it in. And so I'd like to just walk through these, and Rich, if you can do your sort of very briefish description of you think what's at stake, that would be helpful as we go through them. Is that all right?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I got you. So I thought I would skip on down to these, and we'll work our way through. I'll be taking notes, and I'll share my notes back as we go.
Yeah.
But there's a couple that start at 42, 55, and 78. So I'm just going to scooch on down there. Oh, not in this document. Sorry, hang on. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, it'd be good if you could put the yellow highlight on the screen.
Yep.
Because I just checked what's posted, David, and the yellow highlighted version is not posted.
Yeah, I thought it was, and then Liz, something happened when you updated the bullet list. And could you repost all the files that were below that bullet list as well? And in the meantime, I will show my Word document
Okay.
or that has all
Yeah,
the,
right. That'd be
correct.
most.
I have a PDF that shows all.
Yeah, just for context setting here, um, the, both the ANR and the Department of Public Service submitted really careful comments and edits on all of the cross-sector chapters. And I was asked at the last meeting, and steering committee asked me also to see if I could integrate both the DPS comments and the ANR comments into the pre-existing draft and harmonize everything to the greatest degree possible. And I did that. And an interesting aspect of this was that the DPS and the ANR comments didn't always agree with each other. And so I've tried to note that in my comments. I can report that happily, I don't know, 80%, 90% of all the edits that were suggested were easy to accept because they were consistent with the pre-existing text and consistent with where the council had given direction about where, the direction that council wants to go. So there is tons and tons of edits in the current version that I didn't highlight in yellow because they were consistent with council conversation and also were improvements for understanding. So there's only a few that I highlighted in yellow, which I had promised to do if I thought there was something substantial. So
Right.
Number one is this paragraph beginning at line 42. This was previously in the text, and one of the agencies suggested deleting it. And my opinion is, based upon what we've been talking about, that it should stay in. We're talking about the problem here that also Carrick raised in his additional note today, that we're losing money from the federal government and we must find new ways to pay for the climate work necessary.
Great. So this is one of these where it's going to be tricky, but I guess, we're looking for a sense of all of you on the call right now. Like any concerns with leaving this in? And, Billy, you're going to be a little bit on the hot seat today, but and as sort of the official A&R representative, but if we leave this in, any concerns at this point, given the context around it?
Yeah, so let me just provide some broader context. I think the original text and the comment from Secretary Moore spoke to the tension between achieving this work in an affordable fashion and what I think we all see as the infeasibility to do so by the 2030 emissions reductions deadline, or that many folks feel like there's a real tension there between achieving that reduction in an affordable way. So Julie's comments were to either kind of call that out explicitly or remove some of the language. This paragraph has been pretty significantly reworked, so that tension is less present. It acknowledges the need for additional funding to achieve the obligation. So I think that should be consistent with what Julie was looking for. I will
Thanks, Billy.
flag something similar. She had flagged something similar at the end of this section that isn't highlighted in yellow. So when we get down to there, I'll flag that again for you, Dave.
Okay, great. So unless other counselors have a concern, let's go ahead and leave this in, if that's all right with folks. In the next one, there's this comment around this reference to tyranny of the status quo, and talking about Vermont's continuing dependence on fossil fuels as an example of this problem. Again, this was something that ANR proposed pull out, PSD left it in. Billy, is there anything you want to say about that? Is this something also in the context of everything we've done in the preamble language that you're comfortable with, or is there something we should know here about that? Why it should come out?
I don't know her thinking there, other than I don't know that she thought it added much to the substance, but I don't, if folks don't have a strong feeling against this, I don't see the problem by leaving it in.
Okay. Any counselors concerned about leaving this in, if we were to leave this text in? Okay. Why don't we go ahead and leave this text in as well? Thanks. That's really helpful. So Rich, this third one was about some greater specificity about how you would use cap and invest proceeds as rebates to low and moderate income households, right? And PSD said, to use a phrase, so they're held financially harmless in this policy. I think that raised some concerns with you, Rich. Before we just add that phrase in, was there something you want to say, Rich, about that?
Yeah, I think this may come up in a variety of policy discussions that we're going to have. We have in the text regarding cap and invest been, very what's progressive, I guess you'd say, in wanting to make sure that to the greatest degree possible, low and moderate income households, particularly low income households, will receive rebates or direct payments to offset the costs of the cap and invest program, and that we would like to see that built into the architecture of a cap and invest program. But the term financially harmless seems to me to be a very strict version of that good public policy goal. And that, it's tough to design any public policy program that literally holds all low and moderate income households absolutely paying nothing. And I think that that's a straitjacket we should not apply to climate policy. It's not a straitjacket that we apply to, wastewater treatment facilities or electric transmission lines or lots of other things that we know are needed. So,
Rich, can I make a suggestion on this, which is we've added into the cap and invest language a clause that Will had put forward, which is to prevent cost of living increases for those households, for low and middle income households from the program. So that's the language as it stands right now in cap and invest. It says to prevent cost of living increases for those households. So,
yeah, that text taking into account, the fact that the phrase cost of living increases can be, interpreted in a moderate way. And also that a lot of what we're talking about here is investing in weatherization and heat pumps and electric vehicles to reduce fossil fuel bills. And, that's the goal is to make investments
right.
gradually over
Yep.
time.
Yep. So I'm just going to move us kind of quick here, Rich.
All
I
right,
apologize
fine.
to
You just
jump in
want me to
like
move
this.
on. So
We are cooking right now.
I
So
think this language is fine as, as I've presented it.
I'm
Great,
good
so-
with not. I'm good with not taking hold harm of not inserting hold harmless. The more I
Right.
listen to you, Rich, I was going to question my own judgment, but I think in the end, I agree that we don't need to add hold harmless.
right. And
Okay.
so,
Thank you.
Carrick, are you comfortable with the language as it's showing up in our cap and invest language, which is to prevent cost of living increases for those households from the program?
Am I? Yes.
Okay. And any counselors, would they be concerned if we added into the text you're seeing right now, this phrase, which is in the cap and invest language, which is to prevent cost of living increases for low and moderate income households? Any concerns about that?
I support that.
Thanks, Shayla. Okay, great.
David, I think
Yeah.
we also need to keep the language that says, while also supporting investments
Great,
in vehicles and heating systems.
great.
I mean, you got to invest in order to save.
Got it. Okay. So I think that does it for that particular,
So I have one other edit that Secretary
yep,
Moore had that you don't have highlighted. I think starts on line 113 to 114.
great. Yep.
Yeah, it bridges the page. So it's a sentence. We recommend doing so through strategies that are realistic, affordable, and equitable. So this goes to like this larger theme that I know Julie's been pretty consistent about is this tension between the 2030 goal and doing that in a way that's affordable and equitable. And I know that she's a very strong proponent of this plan, just calling out the fact that that's intention and that all of the modeling we've seen and all of our work suggests that it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve that 2030 reduction in an equitable and affordable way. But without being explicit about that, I think she would prefer not to have these recommendations around doing things equitably without some sort of caveat. So her recommendation was just to strike that line that bridged 113 to 114, or to provide more explanation about the feasibility of the existing GWSA targets.
Right. And we've spent quite a bit of time in the preamble language trying to thread a needle about how to talk about feasibility. So it makes me a little bit nervous doing anything besides using preamble language here. Um, uh,
Okay, I'm just flagging that this
yeah,
was, and I'm not going back to the preamble to see how it compares or contrasts at this moment. So.
right. So would anybody be concerned if we struck this line in 113? Strategy realistic, affordable, and equitable, just because it opened up a can of worms of additional uh, context that we want to provide and would take us some time to write.
I'll go with Billy. I'll go with Billy.
Okay. Others, any concerns about that? We talk about all these issues of affordability, equity throughout the document, throughout the preamble. So I guess one of the issue here is that um, you know, maybe we rely how we talk about it elsewhere in the documents.
I think it's important to have it in there, but I mean, I wouldn't, I just think, or maybe it's a question of just adjusting it slightly so that it's what we're advising. It's what we're
Right.
recommending. I don't know, I'm just a little concerned about taking out entirely. This is what we aim to do. This is the intention of it. Um, but maybe it doesn't matter if it's stated so well elsewhere.
I mean,
I think leaving it in with the addition of a clause that said after equitable, while acknowledging these values may be in tension with the current GWSA targets would be sufficient.
I'm not thrilled with that addition exactly, but I'll leave it to those of you who have been working on this a lot longer to adjust that. That's just my 2 cents.
So here's my thought, folks. This is very much getting at the heart of what took us a long time to work on the preamble language. So I feel like freelancing it here in the end of this document feels challenging to me because we've spent quite a bit of time trying to navigate this issue of feasibility. So unless there's strong concerns, my recommendation, if this feels like it's getting halfway there in that conversation, why don't we take it out and rely on what we have in the preamble? If folks want to look at that preamble language right now, I'm happy to pull it up.
And I apologize bogging this down. I'm just trying to communicate what I know is an important point for Julie. And if you want to kind of just table this and talk with her when she's back, that's fine, rather than diving into the preamble.
Okay. Joey?
I mean, I'm happy to wait, or if you want to pull up the preamble, fine.
Sure.
I think part of the reason that it's challenging is because we haven't lifted significant things since we first enacted a climate action plan in 2021. So of course, getting to 2030 is going to be much more difficult. So I'm happy to see the preamble language, and I think we have worked very hard to acknowledge that we need to make progress and it has to be cost effective.
To be fair, Joey, though, haven't almost all of the primary recommendations of the original plan been enacted, at least All right,
No,
we don't need to get into that right now, but
we can,
okay.
but no.
Yeah. Okay. So, just so folks have eyes on it, this is the document that's linked on the webpage right now, the most recent version. And we really talk about the context for this plan, and we try to weave in these different things that are important to each of you. And some of you put greater emphasis in one area, others in other area, but the important thing is, can we weave them together into a common story? I think we've been feeling fairly successful about how we weave them into this context, where we make these points about investing in reducing emissions and resilience, where we make the point of a period of unprecedented federal spending and investment is coming to a close. And that really is going to reverberate on Vermont and the kinds of thinking and actions Vermont's going to need to take. We also talk about the federal government not only curtailing spending, but also actually reducing and pulling back support for key policies that can help drive emissions reductions in particular. And we have this line that even before this challenging context, Vermont faced a heavy lift to achieve its 2030 emissions reductions requirements under the GWSA, as well as struggled to fully recover from disasters. And so that leads us to, the kind of conversation that's in here, weighing multiple criteria, et cetera, right? And taking responsibility for Vermont's own contribution to the crisis. And, this plan is stepping up to look at this. So, this was carefully crafted language that I think provides more nuance than, say, what's going on at the end of that one chapter. And so my recommendation, if folks are okay, is to let this preamble language sort of stand strong in the introductions to all the priority actions and in your executive summary. And if we're running into trouble like what we are right now, where we feel like the nuance doesn't come through in a certain line, then I would lean back on this.
So, David, I just have a question. The language that would be struck is just the one sentence. We recommend sentence.
That's what Billy's saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm the author of that sentence, and I think it's a very sensible sentence, but I'm happy to remove it if it solves a problem, and if the real issue about 2030 is addressed somewhere else, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Other counselors comfortable doing that just as a way of moving forward and making sure that you are providing the kind of as close to consensus nuanced language as you can. Okay to strike that one sentence. I can go back to that one sentence. Give me a second. Okay, I see a thumbs up. Any concerns? Okay, great. So just so I have eyes on it one more time, this is the sentence we're talking about. And again, I'm gonna be moving quite quickly today, so I apologize if it feels like I'm moving too quickly, slow me down. But if we don't move quickly, we're not gonna get there. This is the one sentence we're talking about. What we recommend doing so strategy is realistic, affordable, and equitable. And the reason we're taking it out is because it doesn't have that kind of extra nuance that we're looking for that builds more consensus among you as a council. Okay, great. So that's the end of this document. The next one is the buildings and thermal. And our punch list includes this piece. And Rich, I thought in the steering committee, we talked about, this is about adding some other years that speak to the volatility of fossil fuels. I thought the steering committee was like, yes, please, let's just go add in another year or two or something like that.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay. And I think so, folks, just from a council standpoint, this is not a big deal. This is about just providing some greater context and more years in addition to 22 about this.
I would propose to add the 24 data. I think we have an average number as well, but that's already in there.
Great. Yeah, I think the intent was just to show like a greater variety of years that demonstrates volatility and how things move
that's
around.
fine.
Okay, great. So let's pop to the things that require a little bit more attention. One of them is this yellow one. It's a sentence in the context of fuel switching and doing the kinds of things like, putting heat pumps and that kind of stuff. and switching to electric as a source of energy. This is a sentence that got written in here about stimulating Vermont's economy because more money will circulate in the state. I think ANR was uncomfortable with that, and I think maybe because it wasn't, I don't know. Maybe Billy, you have a greater clarity what the concern is there.
See her. Just keep moving on. We can go back to that one for a
Yeah,
second.
and I think the issue with this, and I maybe Rich, this is the issue is, you can say definitively more money will circulate in the state because you know that you have the stats on that. What's a question mark is more money circulating in the state definitely means stimulating the economy, I guess might be the issue there. But maybe that's parsing, splitting hairs.
Yeah, I don't think this is a significant issue if most of you want to keep this in, but it was something that Julie asked to be taken out.
Great. Michelle?
I guess I would flag and ask Carrick about this as it relates to investments that require electrical energy that, may or may not be generated in the state going forward. I mean, I think we've had great track record, but I guess I would question that. I don't know if Carrick's still on or not.
Yeah.
Yep, right here, Michelle. I would say I view that change on line 30 and 31 in the context of 40 and 42, where we have a proposal. I think you can say it will de facto, if you make some of these policy changes, there will be more money circulating in the state. On a net basis, though, does that lead to a better, more healthy economy? That's why we're proposing the sentence that you see there, Michelle. That's what I would say.
And 40. Yeah. Got it. Jared?
I just want to note that, the statement about more of our heating dollars staying in state when we're heating with electricity and with wood and with many of the, recommendations in the cap, including weatherization, is if I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Fossil fuel is 100% imported to Vermont. The vast majority of the cost of paying for fossil fuel goes to pay for the commodity fuel. Different fuels have different shares of in and out of state dollar spends and flows, but on average, about 75 cents of every dollar that we spend on fossil fuel leaves the state economy with electricity. A much higher share of that energy of those dollars goes to pay for things like line maintenance and tree trimming and customer service operations and power purchases. And yes, many of those are out of state. There are, transmission costs that go to the region, but it is a very well researched and non-controversial point to make that much more, in terms of energy dollar flows, much more money leaves the state when spent on fossil fuels as compared to electricity or wood heat or weatherization, something that involves a lot more local labor in terms of the total cost. So I'm not clear why this is problematic or controversial. It's a very objective, straightforward statement.
Great. So what if we leave this one in? It sounds like Billy opened the door to that. And then let's pivot then to this one. And it sounds like, Carrick, this is something important, and it sort of provides a little more context of like, we haven't really done the full quantitative analysis about what the impacts are. Is that what you're trying to say?
That is what I'm trying to say, David.
Yeah. Okay. Any concerns about putting this in there in the way it is?
Can I suggest that you put a little bit of parameters around the sort of quantitative analysis that we're talking about?
Yeah, help me do that.
I agree. I think this is important, but the scope and nature of that quantitative analysis, I think, would be helpful here to identify what hasn't been done.
So
Rich, go
I
ahead.
guess I would ask Jared to comment on this as well.
I mean, I think, as always, we should continue to study and look at new data and continually update analysis. But every analysis that we have seen to date, the EFG and Cadmus study, the recent updates has shown net energy savings and net benefits to society of the modeled measures to meet the emissions reduction requirements. So I'd be a little uncomfortable saying that the analysis has not been done, because we've had multiple rounds of analysis that have shown net savings from this transition, and I've never seen an analysis that doesn't show that. But of course, we should always be updating data and analysis, but I think it would be problematic to say that quantitative analysis has not been done, because we've had multiple rounds of that. And I recognize that a lot of that was happening, in years prior to some members of the council joining, so they may not be aware of that. But
So, and I'm one of those very new members, and so I apologize if this is treading on territory that's already well tread, but I'm aware of macro analysis, but with any policy choice, there's winners and losers, and I think it would be important to understand, to
Yeah.
leave room for the potential to understand who the winners and losers might be, because that's how you figure out how to make it more equitable.
So I wonder, there's two things going on here, and I wonder if we can figure out a way to merge them. One is there is a statement here about this lowering the total cost of heat, right? And Jared, Rich, folks who have been looking at the macro analysis have data, I assume, that supports that, right? And there is a question about the sort of more detailed quantitative analysis to understand the way that those heating costs actually behave under different scenarios and stuff like that. So I wonder if there's ways, I don't know, Carrick, if you would agree to that, sort of like, can we make this distinction between overall analysis that's been done that shows overall benefits from the efficiency of heating transitions and things like that, while recognizing that the detailed analysis about how those different costs and benefits play out in the economy have yet to be done?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, look, great discussion. I get it. But what always seems to be missing here is it's great for society at large, but everyone needs to eat in the long term. Everyone needs to be able to pay their monthly bill that's happening. And that is the kind of analysis. And what I would say is, when there has been a more specific analysis of a specific initiative with broad impacts, the results haven't been entirely positive. So we need to be honest with ourselves here. This is to me, if there's that clarification, I guess I would say, David, that you're suggesting, I'm comfortable with that. Because I acknowledge the writ large, which extrapolates from existing factors when we know our world is pretty quickly changing. And I'm going to keep hammering this point. For instance, we've had to change our rate projection just in the last, I think we've done 3 since January, and we're now up to 25% by 2030. And look, fellow I'm councilor members, what I'm trying to do here is to keep it real, or, I mean, it may not matter what my vote is to you all, fine, but either you have to keep this real, or it's all a cynical exercise, and I'll say fine, and it won't have any impact. If it's going to have some impact, that I'm looking for as much legitimate acknowledgement of the challenges we face to implementation. And this is a modest attempt to try and do that.
So if I were to say, the elements of a combined sentence that someone's going to need to write, not right now in real time, but the elements of a combined sentence of this would acknowledge the sort of macro type studies that have been done to show the benefits of this kind of transition and heat switching, while noting the detailed analysis about how that plays out in the economy under today's conditions has yet to be done. Are those the two elements we want to say? And Rich and Jared and others, are you comfortable with that?
I think I want to find how do you say it? I'm on common ground with Carrick, and I want to make a suggestion that I don't think the answer is the sentence that's proposed. I think the answer is found, could be added at the end of the next paragraph, where we say the first challenge is affordability, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of that sentence, we state the challenge is often one of timing, how to finance investments now in order to lower bills over time. Carrick's point is there is also the challenge of making sure that, how you say it, making sure that the distribution of impacts is equitable.
Okay.
And in other words, it isn't that, as Carrick has stated, it's not that it's the total cost of heat that's the problem. It's that we need to analyze how these policies affect different types of customers over time.
And amidst different policies and impacts that are having right now, Rich, I would say.
Oh, well, then, I mean, I don't know how we have generally talked about the challenge of the loss of federal funding and the context of increasing power costs, but I'm not quite sure how to.
Well, here's another factor I have in my.
Maybe you and I should come up with.
Here's an idea for the interest of time. I wonder, counselors, if Carrick and Rich could agree on a way to get this idea in there. Would other counselors be okay in that output? Would that be okay, plan? Yeah, I see a lot of thumbs up. So Carrick and Rich, we're on it. We're gonna get this.
Where was my thumbs up? You didn't ask me for my
Sorry.
No, happy to do that, Rich. I just want to know for the group and for Rich. I also, lastly, on this point, I just want to say, what I'm also mindful of, though, is not suffering from we've invoked Milton Friedman, for instance, is not. Let me throw another one. Hayek. I'll throw Hayek at you, and we shouldn't suffer the conceit of planners, namely that we know exactly the value proposition for these initiatives we're contemplating pushing forward on. So, for instance, the data point is on the performance of cold climate heat pumps and what we're finding relative to their performance based what the assumptions were going in. And so we're in the midst of reimagining, reconfiguring exactly how many and how much ratepayer dollars should go in on a per measure basis in terms of efficiency and converting to cold climate heat pumps. I'm asking for a little bit of humility and acknowledgement of a people's ability to pay towards this larger societal benefit. And then I'll be quiet. So Rich, that's also in my head. That's exactly, so this is what you and I will be collaborating on intensely.
We will come up with the perfect 2 sentences to address all 3 points.
Okay.
I love it. I love it. Thank you. And I appreciate, and the rest of the council is very appreciative of that willingness to do it. Speaking of coming up with other things, the next piece on our list here is this sentence about affordability and making the statement that the fossil fuel status quo is part of the state's housing affordability problem, right? And I guess, Rich, the idea behind that is that it is a more expensive way to heat your house to deal with the volatile fossil fuel costs in that. So I think Julie, Billy, turning to you.
Yeah, so
Julie,
out of this again, like this isn't like fully accurate, right? Like in certain communities that are served by natural gas, there's more parity in costs. The upfront cost to build new homes that are fully electrified is significantly higher than not. So like if you're speaking to our current affordability problem, like I don't know that this statement is entirely true everywhere, and it's just not necessary. I think it oversells, it creates correlation between these things that I felt that the secretary felt was probably unnecessary.
got it. Michelle, and then Stephanie.
There we go. Yeah, I guess I feel like there are so many factors that tie into the state's housing affordability issue, relative to um, cost of land, increase in the housing, you know, the cost of materials, etc., shortage of labor. I mean, there's just this is one thing, but there's such a wide array. I wouldn't want to place this much emphasis on this particular element.
Okay. So, I mean, Stephanie, go ahead. Sorry.
I actually, in reading that, I also thought I had to read it several times before the words "is part of" stood out to me, because I also thought, well, wait a second, this is making it frame it as though and there are so many different issues that play into it. So I agree with that, but it is in there, is part of, and so maybe it's a question of finding some different words so it would change the emphasis so that it still recognizes that it's a significant pressure on the housing affordability problem, but that it's I mean, it's not that it's inaccurate, but there's something about the way this is stated that does, I think, I think the balance is maybe not quite right.
Right. So, Rich, what if,
I wouldn't want to take it out, in other words, but just sort of is there a way to adjust it?
right, Rich, what if you and I worked on a new line that tried to change the emphasis a little bit, notes the housing crisis, notes that heating costs are part of that, but doesn't try to make some like overstated claim about heating costs being the fundamental driver of the housing crisis?
Happy to work with you on it.
Okay. Does that work for all the counselors? Rich and
I
I
just
take this feedback? Yeah. Billy?
happy to see you bring something back, but I just don't know that this is accurate. If you're looking in the short term, I just don't know that this is entirely accurate. So I think long term, absolutely. But if you're looking at obstacles to getting housing built to address our immediate crisis, I just don't think this is accurate.
So
Um,
to be fair here, don't think that the text talks about getting housing built. It talks about the, daily and annual costs of owning a home or renting an apartment.
Billy, what if
there's an
we loop you
upfront
in?
cost
Hey
to
guys, I don't want to
convert.
get wrapped into
Yeah,
this one. What
you
if
guys take it away and bring something back. That sounds great.
that's what I was going to suggest. And Jared, if that's okay, I'd love to move on from this one. I think Rich and I can work on something, bring it back to Billy, and if other counselors are confident that we'll get to some good place, let's leave it there. Okay, moving right along. Thank you all. Hang on just a second. Let me get back to the right screen. Scrolling down here. Is that it? Is there anything else back here? All good. Oh, here we go. This is the final kicker on this. This final thing, Rich, you can say a little bit about this. This is the last piece around utility regulation, performance metrics of regulated utility. I can't remember what our language and the actual recommendation is. I feel like we should align with that. And I'm just curious about how this best aligns with what's in the priority recommendations.
I'm happy to say whatever. It should align, but for what it's worth, I think that there should be an examination of the degree to which performance-based regulation and other regulatory strategies align with the goals of the GWSA. But this isn't one to die over.
Got it.
And the recommendation we should see what's recommended in the electricity section.
Let's go back.
I just want to offer here quickly. The goal here was, and is to we just don't want a presupposed outcome. That's all. And that was the attempt of what the language is attempting to do. If there's a better way to do that, okay. But
But
that's for the sake of what the motivation was.
yeah, but Carrick, then the language that's written just says examine how to, it doesn't say how, it just says examine how to.
Yeah, yes, I'm representing our team on some of these edits, and I have stated the rationale. How's
Okay.
that?
Awesome. Here, this is what, if counselors are okay, let's do two things on this. One, we'll go back to the actual language of the priority recommendations. And two, if Rich and Carrick are talking about that other issue we're just dealing with, let's double check how we land on that in that conversation. If counselors are okay, Rich and Carrick can land on something that makes sense and is aligned with what the actual recommendations say. Sound good?
Oh, geez, could we go back to line 69 briefly? And this will be the last of my
Let me just take
annoying
my notes. Give me 1
editorials.
second. I'll be right there.
Sure.
Okay, here I come. You said 69?
Please.
Okay.
So this paragraph summarizes the recommendations in the chapter, weatherization, thermal efficiency, cap and invest, and it says they can be implemented gradually and they can be designed to leverage, to basically to minimize near-term impacts on price. And that's all true. But Julie had asked that we add a sentence that basically says, admittedly, taking this more gradual approach will likely result in Vermont missing the 2030 emissions reductions requirement in the GWSA, because I think that's largely true. So certainly agree that these policies can be implemented gradually in a way that minimizes upfront cost impacts, but that's going to lead to a curve that probably goes past 2030 to hit our reductions target.
So again, touching into that feasibility conversation that's quite challenging, right? And we sweated over in the preamble language. I wonder, Billy, if there's something there where we can circle back to the language in the preamble about, being a heavy lift, right? Increases the heavy lift. A gradual implementation increases the heavy lift of right? So we could use preamble language that's felt comfortable for folks. Yeah.
Okay.
Jared?
I just want to say that I think an important distinction here is that what Billy is saying, I would agree with it if a cap and invest program was the only recommendation that was being made in the cap and was the only means by which to achieve emissions reduction. But because there are other complementary policies, some of which do not have a price tag associated with them, some of which do. I think it is important to recognize that we're not recommending one single way to do this and that there are other complementary policies. So the extent to which, how far you go in achieving emissions reductions through a cap and invest program will then affect, the balance of other policies and strategies. So I don't want to get overly focused on just one piece of this, recognizing that it's a dynamic kind of plan and policy environment.
That's fair. You could take it up in however you like, David. My only point is that even all in with all these examples, doing it in a gradual way that has no upfront price impacts is not going to bring us to 2030.
Got it.
Let's
So
move on.
and this is like that key tension about how to express that in the written word has been one of the core pieces of that preamble language conversation. So my recommendation is we want to get that kind of idea into this document, that we like literally cut and paste from the preamble and speak to the fact that gradual implementation increases the heavy lift of reaching its, the statutory emissions reductions. Something along those lines. Would folks be comfortable with a line that pulls from the preamble text and speaks to the fact that gradual implementation is part of the heavy lift? Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I thought in a prior example, we decided we were just going to go with the preamble as the overarching statement and not repeat it within the sections. So I guess
Yeah.
I'm wondering if this is another example of this, where the preamble needs to clearly state up front that we have this potentially structural issue with meeting the goal.
Right. Right. I'd love that. I'd love that. And I think, and the way we handled that last time was actually pulled a sentence out because it had part of the story, but not the full story. Um, I, so I don't know whether folks would be more comfortable in this case pulling this sentence out or more comfortable adding in one of the sentences from the preamble. So my instinct, Michelle, on this one is let's just add in a sentence from the preamble of heavy lift and make that as a counterpoint to this sentence.
I think that's fine.
Okay.
All this is because, I mean, and I get it, Billy, the work you're doing, and as Julie has, she's the one, candidly, David and everyone, right? She's the one on the hook that gets sued if stuff doesn't get done. So if I certainly am understanding of Jules' position, if you're the one that's staring down the barrel of more lawsuits and seeking to have some candor invested and articulated throughout. So I'm good with having that in this instance. I'm good with Michelle. I'm good with having that sentence from the preamble.
Okay.
I wish we talked about the fact that that lawsuit is what we're looking at, but I'm going to let that go.
Okay. All right. So we made it through the buildings and thermal. Actually, I want to share that same document again. Sorry. Next up is the I think is transportation or electricity, excuse me, and then transportation. Here it comes. All right. In the electricity document, again, this is one of these like very small changes, but it sort of, speaks to like how well are we substantiated in our prediction of the future. This one is talking about, again, the electricity system and its ability to be prepared for electrification. And there was a sentence in there saying it will need to reliably service and serve hundreds of thousands of new heat pumps and electric vehicles, et cetera, right? It's like that is the projection that is made. And then there was a concern that maybe that's speaking too much about we actually know what the future is. I guess that what that may is. I don't know, Carrick, if this is coming from your team.
Yep.
I mean, a lot of folks are pretty confident in about this future of heat pumps and electric vehicles.
Okay.
But are you saying like, hey, listen, folks, don't be quite so confident?
Hey, I have seen great confidence that this is what's going our energy future has been 5 or 6 times at least, like one a decade at least, for the last 4 years, all of which have been wrong. So this
In their
may be,
velocity.
yeah. So this may be. I'm just saying, come on, people. We're already discovering some, and that's not to say that I don't want this and think that this could be very advantageous. I think we just need to demonstrate, again, a little humility and be able to predict the future. That's all. I
How
don't think
about
this
a
is
solution of will likely? It leaves a little wiggle room in there.
fine. You know what? In the interest of comity and collaboration, fine.
Love it. Thanks. Okay,
You're
will
welcome.
likely. That makes sense to everybody? We can't say what the future is 100%, but we kind of have a signal of where it's going.
That's fair. That's fair.
Okay, great. If that's good for everybody. That's it for electricity. Nice job, folks. That's clean. Transportation. Let's move in here.
So David, I just want to make a preliminary statement that that the administration's group worked collaboratively on this. And so while all the comments appear to be coming from A&R, we collaborated on the input from the administration.
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you for that. And I think, this is one of these situations, this very first one, this is one where there were different comments, whether it came from DPS or from ANR. So again, and Billy, I'm not entirely sure, um, the sort of underlying concern here that maybe we could address with some modification of this sentence or sentences. Like the second one is factual, right?
Yeah, I think part of it is just some of these are just they seem to be trying to add a level of drama that doesn't seem to be necessary or appropriate for a technical report. Um, just the way they just seem unnecessarily.
Like words like drain and things like that.
Yeah, I
Okay.
don't think we need that first sentence, right? It's not critical to the rest of the report. It's clear that there's costs associated with transportation, and it's covered at length elsewhere in the document.
How would it work if this was more just sort of fact-based of like Vermont families and businesses spend over $1 billion a year on transportation fuels,
Correct.
right? Something like that? Okay. Does that work for everybody? Okay. Let's do that. So we'll do a sort of more factual thing. This is how much Vermont spends on transportation fuels a year. Okay, great. Next. Let me see how long this goes. Okay, so it goes to the end here. If this is not added, the following. So this is a recommended addition from DPS. Should we just sit here and read this for 1 second? Okay. Does anybody have a problem having this narrative in here? It's basically, sorry, I can't get it all on one page. Right? Talking about the barrier of getting EVs in the hands of households could benefit the most from the savings. Sort of reality of relatively high cost today. Uptake. Finding
Is it
continued
clear?
source of
Sorry,
funding.
this is going to be a obvious comment from
Yeah.
me, but it, I think that's okay as long as it's clear we're talking about ground transportation vehicle EVs. I don't think that these statements are all true for aircraft electric vehicles.
Great. I'm glad we're thinking ahead. Yes. That's, I would have never even thought about that. That's fun. Thank you, Brian. Okay. We can make sure that that's not insinuated in any way. Jared?
Obviously all the data pulled is just for ground transportation. And so maybe just make it clear that we're talking about ground EVs, not
I,
um,
I guess
airframe.
I'm worried that if I think that's true throughout the document, Brian. In fact, I can't remember if there is even a spot in this document where we talk about aircraft transportation. And our modeling does take into account aviation fuels and fuel switching. But I don't think we have any, I think it's widely understood for folks that have been working on this and the general public who engage with electric vehicles that it's ground transportation, not aircraft transportation. So.
How about we do a scrub and just make sure there's no insinuation, and whether it's in this paragraph or somewhere else, we can just ensure that. Maybe Michelle, you and I can just do a quick little scrub, make sure there's no confusion. Thanks, Brian, for bringing it up. It's something I was not even on my radar, so I appreciate you bringing it up. Okay. Jared?
Some of this I'm okay with. I think that there's a couple of areas here that would benefit from more careful and clear language. So the second sentence right now says the relatively high cost of EVs. I would be comfortable with something that said the often higher upfront purchase cost of EVs. But most of the research and that has been done shows significant fuel cost and maintenance cost savings, often averaging $9,000 to $9,500 in fuel and maintenance cost savings of driving an EV rather than a gas vehicle over the life of the vehicle. So I think this gets to a fundamental kind of tension through, that's on the council and throughout the document. When we talk about costs, are we just talking about kind of the very kind of limited perspective of an upfront cost, or are we looking at the full picture of ongoing monthly, annual, and lifetime operations and maintenance costs? So
Yeah.
it is
Okay.
not an accurate statement to say that the high cost of EVs. We can talk about the oftentimes higher upfront purchase cost, but if we're talking about the cost of ownership and driving, that's not an accurate statement.
Right, right. And I think, to be fair, I think it is talking about the upfront cost because that is
Let's make that
the
clear.
previous sentence gets at that. So what if we did a minor modification of this thing, the relatively, or the often higher upfront cost, right? And it just builds off the last sentence. I think that seems like it's what the intent was as well. Matt?
Yeah, just wearing my auto dealer hat here. Oftentimes EVs aren't the most expensive vehicle on the lot thanks to incentives. We've sold a lot of vehicles, we being the auto dealers of Vermont, thanks to very generous lease terms that make them actually more affordable upfront than gas vehicles. The problem, as always, is there's not everyone has a 10 by 20 spot and access to a level 2 charger or a service panel that can acquire that. So when people do and they have a place they can charge when they work, they stick with EVs. When they don't, they go back to gas. That's not mentioned in there. But my real hand up was you don't distinguish between light duty and medium and heavy duty, which is an entirely different proposition.
Okay.
So medium and heavy duty is how the state runs, whether we're moving milk or moving logs, or moving anything that gets to market. And it's a completely different dynamic when we talk to electrification than we do in the light duty market.
My sense with this paragraph is it's referring to light duty, right? I think that's what PSD was trying to get at here. And so maybe we just want to be a little more clear that that's what this particular paragraph is about. And there is more in our priority recommendations about other things in addition to light duty. So if we're able to do two things with this paragraph, we talk about the often higher upfront cost of EV, not always, but often. And we make sure that we're talking about the light duty, which is what this paragraph seems to be about. And oh, by the way, let's make sure in this whole chapter, we're not insinuating things that people might think about as terms of aviation, not just terrestrial. Do those sound like three good updates to this paragraph? Then we leave it in?
What was that last one you said?
The aviation piece that Brian brought up.
Oh. It's terrestrial. I was
Sorry, ground.
Never mind what I was thinking. Never mind.
Okay, great. All right, so we're rolling forward here. Thank you. We've got a couple other ones here. This is a recommendation from DPS. We are now talking about no silver bullet policy. Achieving these goals requires sustained funding in the short term, as well as serious consideration of trade-offs inherent in each policy decision. Rich, is there a reason you just didn't accept this change? This one here?
It's not that I didn't accept it. It was because it was a change that
Oh, I see. Got
substantial, I highlighted it.
Okay. Any concerns at council about this particular sentence that seems relatively innocuous, Jared?
I'm just a little bit confused by it seems inconsistent to talk about sustained funding and talk about that in the short term. So I wonder why it's not just will require sustained funding. Because isn't the point of sustained funding that it exists more than just in the short term? I mean, maybe the point is we've seen reductions in federal and state funding, and so the goal.
Can I suggest something, Jared? Which is this seems so like nobody's in argument about this. If we can get some better language, how about you and I work on this and we'll figure out a way to get the language.
Sure.
Right.
I'm just trying to. I mean, I know we want to get through this, but I think we also don't want to create internal disagreement or lack of clarity in the plan.
Right.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think the short term refers to this market transition period where we will need sustained funding. And I think you know, theoretically, EVs and EV charging will become the market, you know, forefront, and we won't need to incentivize these things or support them in the same way.
Okay, great. So how about we figure this out, and Michelle, maybe you, Jared, and I can get that sustain and short-term thing in the right order. And okay. This is something, Rich, can you say something a little bit about this? What's going on with this sentence?
Oh, I highlighted this language because what I did here was to attempt to take an extensive comment from the DPS and to just translate it and put it into the paragraph. So it's not a disagreement, it's a
Got it.
harmonization, but I thought I should draw attention to the fact that it's new language.
Great. Any concerns as folks look at this? Again, it's reiterating things about inserting equity into the design of a cap and invest and how that's integral to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Any concerns about this?
There are two elements. It's the design of the cap and invest, and also in the distribution of benefits from the cap and invest, which we do emphasize elsewhere.
Right, right. Any concerns about this? Seems like very consistent with the way we talk about cap and invest. Okay, that's great. Okay, we got one more here, at least one more. This is about when we're talking about new vehicle performance standards. Help me understand what's going on here. So A&R suggested deleting some text. Maybe Billy, do you have any insight, or Michelle, into why this text doesn't belong here?
Billy, I think this is referring to clean cars too and clean trucks. Is that in terms of standards?
Which is what's right above it.
Oh, right above it. Sorry. Yep.
And there are two caveats. One caveat is they only apply to new vehicles, and therefore the degree to which they reduce emissions is dictated by the pace of fleet turnover.
Mhm.
That's point one. Point two is the rules are being, are potentially going to be.
I think this is the line that's the kicker, right? And I know that this has been a sensitive line, right? That these programs are important but insufficient on their own to meet emission reduction requirements.
To me, that's just an objective statement that's supported by the modeling.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree.
Great. Okay.
I think largely Julie was just suggesting a lot of language that was explaining the relevance of ACC2 and ACT. I don't think it's critical that it comes out.
Okay. Let's go ahead and leave it in that. It sounds like it's making sense to folks. Now this is aligned with something further down in this document where you pick up language from the transportation addendum that the council adopted that talks about sort of the pieces that are needed. I think, I don't know, Michelle or Billy, is the issue that's must advance for regulatory policies to reduce emissions?
Well, I think there's like a sort of underlying tension here with the fact that the Western Climate Initiative is not allowing for any more entrants into their market. And the New York Cap and Invest initiative isn't even like begun to get off the ground yet, really. So I don't know. I don't know. Billy, were there other thoughts that you recall Julie had on this?
No, I think I'm just trying to put these different versions together. I think you hit it, Michelle.
So
Right.
maybe, I mean, we can continue to say such as, but I think it's like it misinforms the reader that these are actually something we could do now, you know? And so I think maybe with a footnote relative to the status of both of those efforts in this regard would
Okay.
probably take care of it.
Great. So a footnote that just talks about the status of the Cap and Invest opportunities for Vermont to
Yep.
join right now.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Great. Does that work for everybody?
And I think part of the tension, it's just worth saying this, that this is a plan for the next 4 years. And so we're trying to balance what's available now versus what might emerge in the future. So I support Michelle's recommendation of a footnote noting the current context, but also writing the plan in a way that doesn't foreclose the option that could emerge.
Yeah.
Okay, great. One last thing, and folks, then we're going to go to a break. It's this citing of the text from the language that you did back in November when you're trying to, bounce back from the lack of, the sort of TCI not working. And I know this was language that was problematic in the moment, but it made it in. I know ANR has been struggling with this. I wonder, Billy, Michelle, in the context of everything else, in the context of the preamble, citing this previous thing, is there ways that you can feel comfortable with that?
I'm still struggling. I guess I'm struggling with ACT and ACC2 and all of the issues at the national level with and state level with funding for all the transportation related issues. I guess it remains clear that the only currently known policy options for which there is strong evidence from other states, like we talking 2 other states at this point, maybe New York and Washington State, provinces and countries. Yeah, I don't know.
I think
Billy,
the
I don't
issue
know if you.
here is that it's the same thing the same dead horse I keep beating. This seems to suggest that these will get us to the 2030 target.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that's accurate, right? I don't think there's an affordable and equitable way, even if we were to join WCI tomorrow and put into place these other programs that Jared alludes to, that we could hit the 2030 target of the GWSA in an affordable and equitable way. So this seems to create this false narrative that all we need to do is do these things and we'll hit the target. And I don't think we've seen that as feasible. We heard from other states that there's a significant amount of upfront work that needs to be done to design a program so that's equitable. There's a lot of steps that we're endeavoring to take, but the likelihood that that all gets done and is implemented in time to hit to reduce emissions on pace for 2030 is unlikely at best. So this is misleading, I think, from my perspective.
Yeah, I think it doesn't acknowledge the treasurer's report, which basically said even at the highest fee level in a cap and invest, we wouldn't meet 2030. And there's no reference to the treasurer's report either. I think if we were able to perhaps integrate a reference and to those findings and conclusions, that we could still have the cap and invest be like the highest possible alternative, but given our in-depth analysis into whether, how it will advance our objectives, I don't think we're sort of being transparent with the public by not including the findings we've already calculated on our own.
So in the interest of time, and before I jump to Jared, let me just suggest something here. I wonder if there's a sentence that may address what I'm hearing as concerns from Michelle and Billy that says, since this statement, the state of Vermont has done a number of studies to look at cap and invest. 2 important studies the council points to are the technical work that was done by that was shown in February, March, and the treasurer's analysis on the basis of that. And you link to those studies and you just name it that. Would that be a comfortable solution for everyone? You leave this in, you link to those other 2 studies. Again, yeah, thumbs up. Okay, let's do that. All right, as a way.
I'll just note, David, that
Yeah.
I'm kind of listening to Michelle and Billy. It's kind of a weird construct, but talking about the ability to confidently deliver that adverb, I mean, if you're going to have that adverb, it's almost by I agree with Michelle. There's almost a moral
Yeah.
obligation.
Deliver the
Because
scale and pace that are required by the GWSA. It's just, that's not going to happen, right?
I know we can't edit the past sentences being
Correct.
quoted. So I get that. I'm just noting, I got a conflict. Look, I could even like you have a shot with that, but just what we've seen this. I'm sorry, Jared. I'm going to be quiet because I know
Yeah.
you've raised your hand.
And folks, we could go all day on this one, right? We fought about this earlier, and now we're fighting about it again.
Right.
And I think
just,
so.
and
My
that's my last
suggestion.
comment on this, David, since this is
Yeah.
for perpetuity. Our agency fully supports implementing this sort of cap and invest when it's feasible and possible. And we think it is the primary strategy for this sort of emissions reductions. This sort of statement, our concern is that it's kind of misleading the public on its kind of short-term feasibility. Just like there was so much interest in the clean heat standard until it was determined that it had some real infeasibility issues. So like it's just much better to be honest with folks about what's possible and say we still think this is a good idea, notwithstanding those challenges, rather than not be open and transparent about what the hurdles are.
I appreciate that. And I think if folks are comfortable, let's add in that sentence pointing to the two reports since then, and folks can draw the conclusions they want to draw from those reports. Jared, unless it's absolutely urgent, let's call it and go to a break. I think we did transportation. I think that's the end. Is that all right, Jared? Okay. Because this will stay in. Great. Okay, folks. So we did all of that. It's time for a break. The pieces we didn't get to, which are, sorry about the scroll. Hold on. We didn't get to, oh, it's not on this one. This rural resilience piece. My suggestion is, and what Carrick also put, let's take that up in our next meeting. I think we need to use the time when we get back from break to do the consultant reports and then look at our priority actions. Those are just two little things we didn't get to. I think it's amazing we got through as much as we did. And I really want to appreciate everybody. You felt me pushing you, and thanks for your patience with me as I did that. All right, let's take a break. We'll be back in 10 minutes. We're 10 minutes behind schedule. That's fine. Jane's going to take over facilitating when you get back. We'll do public comment when we get back, and then we'll do the consultant stuff. And then we'll use those last 20 minutes to look at our priority actions. Okay.
What time are we back, David?
10 minutes from now. So roughly 20 of.
Thank you.
All right. So see everybody back here roughly 20 of. You won't see me, but I'll be back shortly after that. Thanks, everybody.
In state. And I wonder if the Department of Public Service has ever ground truthed those numbers because, or that line. It puzzles me because Green Mountain Power is a Canadian utility. Obviously, their money goes out of state. Contracts with Hydro-Quebec, Seabrook, that money goes out of state. Almost all the solar and wind projects that are built, those projects are purchased or owned by out-of-state companies. Workers, we see people who don't speak English, Mexicans, doing solar installations. So, I just, it doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't know if I know it's related, it's footnoted to a report, but I would like to know if the department has actually done an analysis of the data that underlies that. My other comment has to do with the discussion that you ended with. We're talking about the challenge of meeting the emissions reductions mandates. And I'm going to say what I've said numerous times to the council. Please be realistic. I think that you are getting close to the point of acknowledging that the requirements for 2030 that are in the Global Warming Solutions Act are not realistic. And I think that the report needs to say that. It needs to say directly and honestly that the emissions reductions requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act are not realistic, and that this council needs to recommend to the legislature that they be revised based on what has been learned. Thank you.
Zanette, any other comments today? Not seeing anybody and seeing Jason on camera, and having Jason and Sylvie's and others from Stockholm Environment Institute, presentation directly related to Annette's second question about what it would take to achieve the 2030 target. I want to invite to present now Jason, Sylvie, and others from Stockholm Environment Institute to build on what we talked about at the in-person council meeting last week and present on the two scenarios that SEI has been able to put together over the last week or so, working closely with Brian Woods and the Climate Action Office and others around how we put forward a scenario that meets the 2030 targets and then on a delayed timeline to meet 2035 and the difference in the measures and costs around doing so. So Jason, Sylvie, not sure who's going to start us off today, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I'll start us off. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for allowing us to be here to present some additional modeling results. We'll actually do a little update on the baseline scenario, but then mostly talk about mitigation scenarios. So I'm going to be starting us off presenting work as soon as we get this slideshow up, presenting work which has been conducted by my colleagues Sylvia Ulloa, Guillaume Bouchard, Emily Gauche, and myself. We're listed here on the first slide. You're welcome to get in contact with any of us at any time if you have further questions about this work that aren't addressed during this meeting. But let's move on to the next slide, please.
Jason, real quick, as we get going and before you really get into it, would you like questions throughout the presentation and for me to monitor?
Thank you for asking.
Or would you like me to hold them?
I think to ensure that we're able to present all of the material that we want to, I'd like to ask for questions to be held until the end. And
Thank
then
you.
we'll move through pretty briskly. We don't have too many slides, so there should be a fair amount of time for questions at the end, but I do want to make sure we cover everything and we don't get stuck not showing the last scenario, for example. So what we'll talk about here very quickly, there is a slide in here which just explains a little bit about the model that we use, but most of the participants here today are familiar with that model, so I'm not going to dwell on that slide. It is there for the record. Then I will very quickly talk a little bit about the baseline scenario and some additional updates that we have made to that since the last time we spoke. And most of the time today will be about mitigation scenarios. We've framed out 3 different mitigation scenarios that we'd like you to use as think pieces, basically for thinking about the challenge of the 2030 target and the longer term target in the law, and about how the different mitigation options that we have discussed with you previously and that we are exploring in the modeling, how they can help respond to that challenge. So we'll talk about what our process was for developing those scenarios, then we'll share some scenario results and then have time for questions. Next slide, please. This is the background on the model. In the interest of time, I'm not going to cover this again. It has been covered in previous meetings, and it's basically a sketch of what the scope of our model is. It is a greenhouse gas emissions model for Vermont designed for this type of analysis, looking at decarbonization options. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of the revised baseline sector results. So since the last time we spoke to the council, we've finished our baseline updates for the power sector. We are still working on some final updates in the commercial sector, but I don't think the commercial sector projections are going to change drastically from what we see in this slide. So this is a slide of emissions by sector over time out to 2050. And with diamonds, you can see what the targets are, the 2030 and 2050 reduction targets in the law, and how they compare to our baseline results. Guillaume will talk a little bit more about the power sector results in a minute, but you can see notably that those in the power sector, the emissions are falling to 0 by 2035, which is when the RES, basically the RES proposes that there should be zero carbon electricity supply by that point. And in general, the emissions in the baseline are decreasing substantially, kind of in keeping with the historical reduction trajectory that you can see since 2015. Next slide, please. I'll turn it over to Guillaume, who will talk for just a minute about the power sector updates and provide a little bit more detail about the emission results that we see.
Thank you, Jason. As Jason mentioned, this is not the focus of this presentation, but we did want to update the council on our progress in modeling the electricity sector emissions for Vermont in our model. We want to allow most time for discussion of those 3 scenarios that Jason alluded to. But here you can see that in close consultation with the PSD, we updated our electricity model to reflect the latest update to Vermont's renewable energy standard, which was passed about a year ago, if my memory serves correctly. And you can see here how that RES affects the emissions from the electricity generation sector. Now, as a reminder, there has not been final rulemaking on GHG accounting in Vermont, but for the time being, our accounting of the electricity sector emission aligns with the latest inventory methodology, meaning it is consumption-based, which is why you see that starting in 2023 and moving until 2035, there are some emissions from natural gas, even though there is no natural gas electricity generation located in Vermont. This is consumption-based. So if Vermont purchases a megawatt hour of electricity from a combined cycle or other natural gas generation plant elsewhere in New England, and then does not offset it with a REC, those emissions are accounted for. And starting in 2035, the RES mandates that 100% of the electricity is renewable, and the renewable or RES compliant does not exactly map one-to-one to be emissions free. We do see that in our model, we get that result starting in 2035. So I'll leave it there for now. If there are questions about this at the end, I'll be happy to answer or provide further detail. And I will pass it now to Sylvia to discuss our mitigation modeling approach.
Thank you. So just to frame the scenarios that we will show you and to briefly recap on the process that we followed to develop those mitigation scenarios, here you can see sort of like a sketch of the process. So we started with the updates to the baseline. And then, as we've presented a few times already, we did a revision and updated a number of individual mitigation measures that covered all of the sectors. And I will show you the final list in the next slide. But we had 25 mitigation measures that we incorporated in the model, including the different ramp rates and assumptions of targets and costs. And by combining these mitigation scenarios or adding them, mitigation measures and adding them on top of the baseline projections, we developed two main mitigation scenarios. One that sees the achievement of the target, so 40% emission reduction by 2030 and 80% reduction by 2050 from the 1990 emissions. And a second scenario where the 2030 target is delayed by 5 years and the 2050 target is maintained. So here in this chart to the right, you can see the orange line represents the historical emissions from the inventory, which align with the emissions from the model. And then out to 2050, you can see in the black line, the baseline projections and the targets here in the green circles with an approximate trajectory that would be needed to meet those targets in gray. So that space in between, this grayed out space, really represents the emission reduction or the additional mitigation that would be required from the baseline in order to meet those targets. And what we see is that by in the calendar year 2029, there would be a need of reducing almost 2 million metric tons compared to the baseline in order to meet that target. And in the 2049 calendar year, about 3.4 million metric tons that would need to be reduced. Now, in terms of the mitigation measures, here you can see the list of the mitigation actions that were considered for each of the different sectors and a cross-cutting measure, excuse me. We've presented slightly different versions of this slide in different meetings as we have revised some of these measures. There are some that have been excluded. So I'll just note some examples for transparency in case you want to compare them to the previous versions that we've presented. So in the residential sector, for instance, we had initially considered Also some measures related to heating. So the advanced wood heating and the more ambitious heat pump space heating were also considered in the residential sector. But as we were reviewing the baseline projections, the baseline already considers a very high penetration of heat pumps in the residential sector. And we're actually still confirming those numbers, which were derived from the 2025 annual energy report for Vermont. And we're tracking down the original source of this information, which seems to be the Vermont Energy Investment Corp and the Efficiency Vermont. So in the meantime, we have excluded that mitigation measure from the residential sector, since basically most of the households have already shifted to heat pumps by 2050. Now, in terms of power generation, we initially had also two additional measures here. One was the early exit from Hydro-Quebec, which we've excluded since this was not really a mitigation measure and it was more of a sensitivity analysis. So that's why you're not seeing it any longer in this slide. And we originally had also another measure that considered 100% renewable electricity by can't remember exactly the year, but that is no longer there since now the RES it's already considered in the baseline. So there's no need for an additional measure in this case. So you can see, I won't go into the details of all of these, but in previous presentations that we've given, we've shared details of the specific assumptions and the penetration rates or ramp rates that were assumed for each one of these, and we'll include that in the set of slides that we'll share. Now, in terms of the process to get to these mitigation scenarios that we will show you in the next few slides, we started by evaluating each one of these mitigation actions individually. So we ran each of these options on top of the baseline and determined what was their mitigation potential and their overall cost. So we prioritize them based on their cost effectiveness. So that's the dollars per ton of CO2 that they avoided throughout the entire modeling period compared to the baseline. And once we ordered or prioritized them in terms of their cost effectiveness, we started adding these measures gradually on top of the baseline, starting from the ones with the lowest cost and moving our way up until we reached the desired levels of mitigation as compared to the target. We continued adding those measures, and then we made some adjustments, as you will see in the next few slides. So I will give a sneak peek into what's coming, but basically we had to add all of the measures in order to get close to the 2030 target. And when we were evaluating the delayed scenario, we were able to explore some slower implementation rates or delaying some of those intermediate targets for some of the high cost measures to see what the impacts of those changes were. So that's roughly the process that we followed. And before I show you the results of this prioritization of the measure, I should note that the model considers a social cost of greenhouse gases, which is included in all of the cost and benefit estimations of the measures. So this slide right here shows the projected values of these social costs of greenhouse gases that were used, which really just estimate the monetary value of the damages that are caused by emitting 1 additional metric ton of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. These values are based on the latest estimates for the US, adjusted to reflect the New York State's climate context, and they use a 2% discount rate. So you can see how the costs go up. So for example, emitting 1 ton of methane in 2020 cost over $2,600 in societal damages. primarily because it has a very potent short-term warming effect, and it contributes to health-related costs. And the cost of 1 ton of CO2, for example, was roughly 120 in 2020, and it goes up to 170 by 2050. So these social costs really incorporate a wide range of damages, from physical impacts like sea level rise, crop losses, to public health and economic disruptions. So really quantifying all of these costs as part of the cost benefit analysis can help make well-informed decisions that reflect the true impact of the emissions. So here in this slide, you can see the result of evaluating each one of these measures individually, and you can see them ordered here in this chart by their cost per metric ton of CO2 avoided, starting with the lowest cost measures and moving up to the high cost measures. And the chart right here shows on the x-axis shows the cumulative abatement potential throughout the modeling period. And on the y-axis, it shows the cost per metric ton of CO2 avoided. Both the costs and the savings that are shown here are over the entire modeling period. And as I just said, these include the externality costs. So because we explored or evaluated each one of these mitigation actions individually, they do not account for potential interactions between the measures that do exist but are not accounted in this first level of prioritization. So this is why we can refer this as a partial prioritization that just evaluates each one of the measures when implemented on its own. So you can see that in terms of the abatement potential, if we focus on this first column, there are some key measures that have a substantial abatement potential compared to others, and those come from the transport sector. So in particular, the ICE sales phase out and the B100 in heavy duty vehicles seem to have a significant potential for reducing emissions.
Sylvia?
Yes.
Sorry, can you not use the abbreviations? Can you just say them out? Because I don't know what all the abbreviations are off the top of my head.
Sure, I'm sorry. So in terms of the abatement potential, we can see the B100 is the 100% biodiesel in heavy duty vehicles, and the internal combustion engines sales phase out by 2035. So those two seem to have significant potential. And then in terms of the cost, the unit cost or the cost per metric ton, we can separate all of these measures into two buckets. So the green bucket here represents or includes all of those measures that have a cost per metric ton that is below zero. So this, what really means is that throughout the entire modeling period, when you consider the cumulative abatement potential and the costs, these measures actually result in cost savings. And then this orange or pink bucket down here represents all of the measures that have a net positive cost when evaluated throughout the modeling period. So you can see that in this first bucket or the green bucket, we find all of the non-energy sector measures. We also see the phasing out of fossil fuels for cooking and for water heating. We see some of the transport sector measures, including the managed EV charging and also the biofuel or the 100% biodiesel in the heavy duty vehicles as the last one in this bucket. We can also see some measures that affect the residential and the commercial sectors, including the district heating, heat pumps in the commercial sector, and advanced wood heating in the commercial sector as well. And in the power sector, we find the increased behind the meter solar photovoltaic adoption in the power sector. I will note that for a couple of these measures, in particular for wastewater and the semiconductor manufacturing, both of which affect the non-energy sectors, we did not have any explicit estimates of the cost of implementing those measures. So the costs that you see here really just reflect the savings that you get in terms of the externalities or the social costs of carbon when those actions reduce the emissions coming from those sectors. You'll see also that the vehicle miles traveled reductions, which is the last measure here, which resulted in the highest cost per metric ton, deviates or is it's quite high compared to all of these other measures that we evaluated. So we are also in the process of working with VTrans to get better estimates of the cost of this measure, and we'll revisit the cost estimations if that's necessary. So this chart and the table right here show you the ordering or the prioritization of the measures that we followed as we constructed these mitigation scenarios that we will show in the upcoming slides. And starting with the first scenario, where we get close to meeting the 2030 and the 2050 targets, what you can see in this chart is the impact of implementing basically all of those 25 mitigation measures that we just showed you at their originally planned rates. So as we went through the process of prioritizing them and adding them one by one, we found that all of them were essentially needed to get to this level of mitigation that you see in this chart. The black line up here represents the gross emissions from the baseline, which Jason showed you a couple of slides earlier. And you can see how the implementation of all of these 25 measures really bring the emissions down to meet the 2050 target, and roughly to meet the 2030 target, which it meets in the calendar year 2030, but the actual target is for 2029 calendar years. But it does get the emission trajectory in a path toward the 2050 goal. You can see in the stacked areas here how the transport sector in particular, which represented nearly 30 or 40% of the emissions, goes down significantly, and it's no longer the sector that contributes the most to the emissions in 2050. You can also see in this chart how for the electric sector, the emissions drop to 0 by 2035, reflecting the RES implementation, as Guillaume mentioned earlier. So now we'll move on to the next couple of scenarios, and I'll hand it over to Jason to
Thank you, Sylvia.
share results.
Right, so this next scenario looks at what would happen if we only included the cost-effective measures. So those are the measures that were shaded in green 2 slides ago. And remember, they're the ones that had a negative cost per ton, so meaning net cost savings per ton of emission or GHG emissions abatement. And as Sylvia said, that analysis did not include interactions among the measures. But I would say that in this case, that's not a really serious omission in this case for 2 reasons. One is that most evidence shows that even when you do account for interactions among measures, that only changes costs per ton, usually by 10 to 20%. And the types of interactions that tend to change costs per ton the most are interactions between fuel switching on the demand side of a model and decarbonization of the fuel supply on the supply side, particularly electricity supply. So if you have an electricity efficiency measure, it makes a lot of difference to its costs per ton of abatement, depending on whether you assume that that gets implemented with a dirty electricity supply or a clean electricity supply. But in our model, as you can see, and as we've talked about, in the baseline, the electricity supply is extremely clean. So there aren't those typical types of interactions between electricity efficiency or fuel switching to electricity on the demand side and then the carbon intensity of electricity supply. So these are the cost-effective measures. They're bulleted out on the left part of the slide. And what we can see with this scenario is that it puts us on track to get to the delayed or to hit the 2030 target by the end of 2034. So that delayed short-term target that Sylvia talked about. But you are substantially off track to get to the 2050 target. The gap there at the end of 2049 is 1.7 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is really showing that we need to deploy all of the measures that we have in the model to be on a trajectory to get to the long-term target. Next slide, please. So after looking at that slice, what would happen if we just implemented the cost-effective measures? We then turned to what would it look like if we wanted to have a 2035 achievement scenario. So that would be delaying the short-term mitigation target by 5 years to the end of 2034, but maintaining the 2050 long-term target. And the way we went about doing this, and there are many different ways that this could be done, but we discussed this with the state staff, and we think this is reasonably clear and simple to understand. The way that we went about doing this is we included all of the measures. For the cost-effective measures, we kept their same implementation levels and ramp rates as in the two prior scenarios that we were looking at. But then for with one exception, and that's for the 100% biofuels in heavy-duty vehicles measure. So for that one and the non-cost-effective measures, we essentially delayed their implementation. If we were talking about a measure that had an implementation target, full implementation by 2050, then we maintained that full implementation by 2050, but we delayed the start year, the beginning of the implementation, by 15 years in most cases. In the case of the 100% biofuel measure for heavy-duty vehicles, we pushed that start date back by 10 years. And if we were talking about a measure that had full implementation targeted before 2050, then we pushed the full implementation date back by up to 15 years, but no later than 2050. And we also delayed the start of implementation by 15 years. So it's essentially shifting those, for the non-cost-effective measures, it's shifting their implementation in time by about 15 years in most cases. Next slide, please. And here's the result that we get. So you can see that shift of the non-cost-effective measures essentially shifts the attainment of the short-term target out by 5 years. We do attain that target by the end of 2034 in this scenario. And it almost puts the state on track to get to the long-term goal in 2050. We're off by 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2050. You can compare that mentally to the 1.7 million that I talked about for the cost-effective measures only. So these are just some ways of kind of bounding the problem. Now, if we put everything we have at the problem, we can more or less get on track. Everything that we have in the model that is at the problem, we can more or less be on track to attain the 2030 and 2050 targets. If we start delaying the implementation of the less cost-effective and probably more difficult to implement measures as a result, then it's more compatible with a delayed attainment of the 2035 or of the 2030 target, and almost gets you to where you need to be, but not quite for 2050. There would need to be some additional effort mustered to hit the 2050 target. Next slide, please. This is just showing you kind of the top line results for all of the scenarios that we've been discussing, starting with that baseline curve in blue at the top of the graph, and then going through the scenario for all cost-effective measures in purple, the 2035 or delayed achievement scenario in that dark brownish color, and finally the 2030 achievement that with all of the measures deployed. in the green color. And you can see how that positions the state with respect to these different mitigation goals. Next slide, please. So zooming in here on the two of those three scenarios, the one that is attempting to attain the 2030 target and the one that delays that 2030 target by 5 years, these graphs here show you where the reductions come from by sector. And I think it's notable to point out here that if you look carefully at these sectoral decarbonization trajectories, they're quite similar in some of the sectors between these two scenarios. For example, I would say in agriculture, in the commercial sector, and they're quite similar. There's obviously, though, a quite substantial difference in the transportation sector. And this really gets at, I think, most importantly, the delay, or one of the big things that's driving this is the delay in the phase out of the internal combustion engine vehicles. So that will have a substantial impact on the total transportation emissions and the transportation emissions in the earlier years of the projection. Next slide, please. Here's another way of looking at some of these scenario results, this time looking at costs relative to the baseline. So this is the additional costs that would need to be incurred or the cost savings that would be realized relative to the baseline. This graph here is of cumulative discounted costs over the period from 2024 to 2050, and well, up to 2050. We actually bucket the costs here. First, we have in the first panel of this graph, we have costs from 2024 to 2030, then out to 2035, then out to 2050 for each of our three scenarios. And we're showing the net costs are showing up as positive numbers above the x-axis and cost savings as negative numbers below the x-axis. And you can see that for all three of these different trajectories, in the long run, by 2050, total cumulative discounted costs are negative, so they represent savings to society over the long run. The negative costs are coming especially on fuel costs. Those are imported fuels into the state. Also in the non-energy sector, we see a decent slice, and in some cases, depending on the particular scenario, in other sectors as well. The positive costs in the long run are coming quite a bit from transportation and then from electricity generation. Transportation costs are related to switching transportation equipment to electric vehicles that might be more expensive in particular. Also adding costs in for the deployment of charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. The extra electricity generation costs, you might be saying to yourself, why would you have those if the electricity generation supply, if the electricity supply is decarbonized even in the baseline? The reason is you just have more electricity demand in these decarbonization scenarios, so that requires more expenditure on electricity supply. And then you can see the picture is a little bit more varied for the earlier years, where the total net costs are slightly positive or slightly negative in 2030, and two of the three scenarios in 2035 have negative costs, while the most ambitious one has positive costs of about $500 million by 2035. Again, these are cumulative discounted costs, and so one way to think about them is it's sort of like the net present value of these packages of mitigation options to the state. What would you need to pay today in order to realize, or what would you save today if you committed to doing this plan over these different time horizons? Next slide, please. So for a final look at some statistics coming out of these scenarios, I'm going to turn it back over to Guillaume, who will just talk about a few key performance indicators that we pulled out of these scenarios that we thought would be relevant to your discussion here, and then we'll move to questions.
Great. Thank you, Jason and Sylvia, for a comprehensive overview of the greenhouse gas trajectories and the costs and benefits of these three scenarios. As Jason just mentioned, this highlights essentially what has to happen on some key sectors in those various scenarios to meet the greenhouse gas abatement and cost potentials. So this first of two slides highlights the vehicle fleet composition in Vermont. So taking a close look at that very critical transportation sector, And in particular, it's breaking down the percentage of vehicles by class, so light duty and heavy duty classes in 2030 and in the end year of our model here by the end of calendar year 2049 in our three key scenarios. So you'll notice the cost-effective only scenario is missing here. So we're looking primarily at the delayed target 2035 achievement scenario and the 2030 achievement scenario. And what you'll notice from this slide is that the 2030 achievement scenario does achieve both in 2030 and all the way out to 2050 a substantially higher fraction of the fleet being electric vehicles. So in particular, in the 2030 achievement, the most aggressive scenario here, you're looking at 95% of passenger and class 1 to A vehicles being EVs in 2050. That number is 75% in the delayed scenario. So that effective, 15-year or so delay does produce a substantial difference, not only in the short term in 2030, but also in the longer run in 2050. So in those first two rows, you're seeing the fraction of electric vehicles. You're then seeing in the next two rows, the fraction of plug-in hybrid vehicles, and then the sum of the two below. Next slide, please. Right. And in a different residential sector, you're seeing here the number of retrofits, both cumulative and average annual in those three scenarios. So you'll see that in contrast to the transportation sector here, the delayed scenario achieves almost the same number of cumulative retrofits by 2050. So you're looking at 190,940 retrofits between January 1st of this year and the end of 2049. Whereas with the more ambitious scenario, you're reaching an ultimately slightly higher level of 193,000 or so retrofits. But you're doing so, at a more aggressive pace in the short term. So that 2030 value is close to 70,000 retrofits between January 1st of this year and 2030, which is producing those substantial differences in the average, number of retrofits per year. So in that more ambitious scenario, you're looking at, doing an average of slightly more than 10,000, 11,000 retrofits annually to meet that that mitigation measure. Whereas in the delayed scenario, that number decreases substantially to 2,345 retrofits per year. Okay. And with that short overview of the key progress, key performance indicators, we'll be glad to take questions about any and all parts of these scenarios.
Thanks, everyone. I have my own questions already, but I'm going to turn it over to you, counselors. And there's one in the chat already from Kelly that says, why are the 2030 numbers for retrofits lower in the 2035 scenario than in the baseline? So I'll turn that back to you, Guillaume, to answer.
Thank you. Yes, that's something that we did notice as well. And essentially it's related to our source data for the baseline, reflecting current pace of retrofits is very high in Vermont. So the delayed scenario here was created to really look at meeting the 2030 GWSA target by the end of 2035. And essentially it's kind of difficult to produce that delay based on historical data. So we had to push back these retrofits, which are an input variable to the model, quite significantly, which leads to, as you rightly noticed, Kelly, the baseline value here in 2030 being lower.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Jane,
I'm seeing some raised hands.
There's some hands up.
Jane, do you want to?
Sorry, thank you. I think I was in the middle. Jared, I see your hand now. You're first in line. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks for the presentation. And I recognize that some of the questions I'm going to ask may not have ready answers. And so maybe it's kind of a request for additional information to be followed up with. One on the electricity modeling, thank you for making those updates. It looks much more consistent now with the kind of committed policy environment that we have in Vermont than it did previously. One of the things I'm curious about, and maybe this is a question for the PSD, it was the really stark shift from any use of residual system mix towards gas purchases in particular. And so we'd just be interested to understand that distinction in the modeling. It looked like it was a pretty rapid kind of almost looked like a switch was flipped from basically purchasing no system mix or purchasing most of our emissions coming from system mix that was purchased to that kind of fully going away and much more fossil gas or natural gas being purchased. So that's one. And then the other one I was looking, I mean, it certainly deserves more careful consideration than can be done just quickly, even as well presented as it was, quickly going through the slides. Some of the things that stood out to me, I think, were some of the things that stood out to you. I would be very curious to know what the assumptions are behind the vehicle miles traveled or VMT reduction that just stood out as such an outlier. And I wonder if it is. I just want to know what those assumptions are and whether they're appropriate and what that really represents. I was also surprised to see that negative values for internal combustion engine phase out and vehicle to grid, knowing that there's many ways in which those significantly reduce costs. And so I would be curious to see kind of a summary of the assumptions behind the ICE phase out and the vehicle to grid as well. Those were the two that were most surprising to me, that they weren't on the other side of the ledger in kind of cumulative sum.
Great. Guillaume, I think you'll start us off.
Yeah, I'll take the question on electricity mix. If you want to go back to that slide, Sylvia. So while Sylvia pulls up that slide, the quick answer is that that's an artificial construct of how we built the model. Our goal was to accurately reflect historical emissions, but project electricity generation based on cost by generation technology. So underlying that residual system mix that you see in years 2023 and prior are a host of generation technologies. And when we move to our scenario period, we want to break those out because they have vastly different characteristics, renewability, eligibility. So that's not actually a real world transition that's happening.
Okay.
You might see, generation shift to natural gas to some extent, but we'd have to dig into the data to give you those values.
So it's really meant to represent the emissions profile rather than the source.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you.
Yep.
And
then on the
Sylvia,
VMT reduction
Yes, so
measure?
on the VMT measure, so as I said, because we see like a very significant deviation from the cost that we got for all of these other measures, we are revisiting those cost estimations. But what you see there, or the assumptions that went into that measure right now, are that the measure manages to reduce the vehicle's miles traveled by 10% compared to the baseline by 2050. And that incorporates a number of different strategies, sort of like a big program that manages to reduce this level of vehicle miles traveled by 2050. And the cost assumptions that we have, which were derived from a previous study from Cadmus, estimate a total cost of the program of $250 million per year. So that seems high, and that's why we are revisiting those costs and working with VTrans to get a more updated estimate on what it would cost to reduce each percent of vehicle miles traveled. And we will revisit that measure once we get confirmation on those numbers or better estimates of the costs.
And if I may, I would just say that, it's such a broad category, and I can imagine within it, there are things that are going to be more or less cost effective. And so I imagine that what that cost number includes, it could be everything from on-demand transit, microtransit to, additional rail, which would be, much more expensive per VMT avoided. So to me, it's not just like what is the cost per percent, but what are the measures that are actually reducing VMT, and are there some that should be included and some that should not in terms of what's cost effective and what is not. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I think that's one of the things we're discussing with VTrans right now. Do they have an updated estimate and an updated understanding relative to that Cadmus study that was the original source for this measure? Do they have an updated understanding of the mix of different options that would be deployed?
Thanks, everyone. Rich, go ahead.
Thanks very much for this updated analysis. I recall that last time I asked you a question about the assumption in the baseline concerning the uptake of residential heat pumps and advanced wood heat. And you were going to look into that. But I have to, repeat my observation that I'm really surprised by the assumption that the baseline, that means without new policies, the penetration of residential heat pumps and advanced wood heat would be so substantial that you didn't even bother to model a program to advance them. And, I would love to believe that that's true, but we've been debating the clean heat standard in Vermont for a couple of years now. And I've heard a lot of criticisms of the performance standard based on the ground that in order to get that penetration of advanced wood heat and heat pumps, it would be really expensive and a really expensive new measure. If your numbers are right, and this penetration rate is going to happen anyway, just based on existing policy, that suggests that the mitigation scenario is a lot cheaper than people thought it was going to be. So maybe you can help me out here. How many heat pumps and how many advanced wood heat installations do you assume are already baked into the baseline? Like I say, I want to believe it's true, but I kind of don't.
Hi, Richard. Oh, Jason.
No, I was going to say, Emily, if you're with us, would you please address that? Thank you.
Hi, Richard. Hi, everyone. I helped develop the residential baseline. So part of the heat pumps, we used an assumption that was from a forecast of heat pump penetration from the Vermont Department of Public Services. I think we're right now interrogating that assumption. In the baseline, there's approximately 360,000 heat pumps installed by 2050, and this more than covers the amount of households within Vermont by 2050. And so the questions you ask are exactly the questions we're asking. How probable is this? Right now, the current install rate of heat pumps is about 10 to 15,000 a year. After a certain point, we're going to need to start replacing those heat pumps. So understanding like how much of those 360,000 is new heat pumps installed versus replacement of old heat pumps, how many heat pumps per household, the types of heat pumps. And so this is something we're trying to better understand from the forecast that we had used for our baseline, and whether there have been changes or decisions made since that was developed that would affect our assumptions. So
Thanks. How do you have numbers on advanced wood heat installations, either whole house or pellet stoves?
We can definitely get that for you from the model, but like I said, because of the high penetration rates of heat pumps, because it more than covered all the households, like we need to understand if it actually covers all the households or if they're just replacement or new installs, and whether
Right.
there'd be households in 2050 with advanced wood stoves or pellet stoves at that point. My guess is given that there's households now, there probably will be some, but we're just trying to understand how those forecasts were developed.
So to follow up on that is a related question about heat pump water heaters, which in many people's minds are an easier measure to roll out than whole house heat pump systems. So, and yet you don't show that uptake rate as in the baseline as being very high. You do show that that a program that would deliver heat pump water heaters would be quite cost effective. And that's baked into your cost effective model. So I guess I'm asking you to think about the connection between your assumption that space heating's going to go like a rocket and water heating's going to go a lot slower and needs more programmatic help. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Rich. Michelle, last word.
In the interest of time, I'll type my questions into the chat and then they can be followed up on later.
Great. So before I turn it back over to David, I want to thank our presenters and just make a note that with SEI, Brian from our office will be supporting some of these, answering the questions that you all have brought up today, refining both the business as usual model as well as the scenario models, and using this input to draft the chapter that speaks to the modeling, which underpins the recommendations for the emissions reductions in the climate action plan. That will be one of the chapters that comes to you all next week for discussion, along with some of those other significant chapters I mentioned at the beginning of today's meeting. So just flagging that I imagine some updated info about the modeling, both the business as usual and the scenarios, will be shared with you to help support your reading and understanding of that chapter for next week. And folks who have these lingering questions will want to make sure they're addressed so that we can substantively address them in the chapter that references it. So thanks again for
Jane. One quick
go
thing
ahead.
here, Jane. I'd like to secure an opportunity. I know, and the team,
yes.
excellent job doing that. But my team is going to need we need a offline full kind of integration between the department and this modeling work, please.
I've already spoken to your staff at the end of last week about that. In progress.
Good. Excellent.
So thanks.
Thank you.
David, go ahead. Back to you. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I did not hear that conversation, so I'll be excited to hear how that conversation influences the way we do a final look now at our priority actions. And if there's any final things we need to say about this consolidated now top 52 list and our top 10 list and the preamble language that comes before it. This is online. Folks can access it through the agenda or here. I'll drop it in. I've made a consolidated document that has preamble, top 10, and top 52, it should say, actually, not 51, in the table of contents there. I thought what I'd do, rather than walk through it, I mean, you can see, I can show you on my screen what it looks like in case it's hard for you to click through to it. It looks a little bit like this. There's a table of contents. It should say 52 instead of 51. There's the framing text, which is what we've been talking about as the preamble language. And then there is edits that happened over the week with that. And then what I did with top 10 is I made, I did my very best at sort of synthesized language that speaks to each of these top 10 actions. And then I bucketed them up in thematically sort of the buckets, right? And so that's what I did. And I welcome if someone has a better way of making synthesized language. I am not particularly wedded to this language, just trying to make it clear for folks. And I'm imagining some graphics that eventually will happen using more synthesized language like this. All right, so we got these top 20, excuse me, top 10 that you got to at your last meeting. And then for the top 52, anything you see in track change is a result of a comment that you all made last week that you thought would be helpful. Some of these, like I worked with Rich on this. And yeah. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. I am curious, folks, having had this conversation around the modeling and having had maybe a quick moment over the weekend or early today to scan through the updates. Is there anything else that needs to be said about these priority actions in the preamble language leading up to them? Anything else as you're kind of getting to the best version you can put forward that folks want to say? Shayla?
Yeah, I'm new, and so I'm sort of seeing the modeling. I mean, I love numbers, but I can't say that I internalized that in that 30 minutes. But one thing that stood out to me was one of our top recommendations was weatherization, and it looks like that doesn't actually pan out in the modeling. And so I'm just like that, it's just a little tricky for me to get the modeling now without further understanding it and how it relates to these priorities and feel confident that we are actually incorporating that information appropriately into our top 10.
Thanks, Shayla.
Because I don't totally understand it. Like I'm very pro weatherization coming from the Agency of Human Services because it hits a lot of goals. Some of them are climate and some of them are public health. And wellness goals that are and aging in place. There's so many things incorporated there, but so I'm not interested in changing that as a priority, but I am interested in understanding why that is more costly, and then whether or not this group still thinks that should be. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Right. So there's some concerns about the costs involved that came up in the modeling. Yep. Jared, you want to speak to that, or are you speaking to something else?
I have a broader reflection that I want to share, which is I am incredibly appreciative of the modeling work that is happening and the challenges that it has faced before, and the kind of very fast timeline it's on. And so while I think it's important that we're aware of what we're learning together as scenarios are updated, additional information is put in, assumptions are questioned and tested. I would just note that there are a number of really big questions that could have effects on the model in different directions, depending on, what we learn about some of these questions about VMT and internal combustion vehicles and vehicle to grid, and Rich's questions around heat pumps. And so I think we should be aware of this and follow this, but I certainly am reading this as still in a draft state that is not delivering kind of final modeled results that have been fully peer reviewed. So I know that's a frustrating answer, but I'm not, given some of the significant outstanding questions that we still want to resolve, I would encourage us to have a degree of humility, and not potentially prematurely make or take some of the draft results and apply them to the cap yet.
Okay. Thanks, Jared. Will?
Really appreciate everybody's very helpful recommendations and engaged process and excellent work from our presenters. And just a quick plug that in the time that we were able to spend together in person previously, that the weatherization so clearly came across as a top recommendation for the group. And I think that belies the compounding effect that we know that it has as a proven entity for many decades in our communities, both with the local economy and the workforce that we're hoping to not just sustain, but expand as we work towards our climate goals collectively. So all of these things are complicated and nuanced, but I wouldn't want to lose that in the process, and hope that we maintain a strong focus on the support that we earlier saw for that in our work together. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Will. Rich?
I think the way we have bucketed some of these recommendations undercut the importance of dealing with the complications of the building sector. I mean, we pull out weatherization as appropriately, and I support that. Then later in the reducing emissions category, we mention utility programs to promote electrification, and then reduce greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles through electrification. But we really ought to be saying reduce greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles and buildings through electrification. That we have, even though we know that's an important top priority, we seem to have cut it up into little bits and put a little bit of it in cap and trade, and a little bit of it in weatherization, and a little bit of it in the power sector. And just want to make sure that they add up to a thermal program that actually would address what is, a third of our emissions.
Okay, so thanks, Rich. So it feels like there's two things that may warrant, I don't know if it's some edit or whether just some, I don't know, something that happens in the introduction, but one is if weatherization in the modeling is kind of having some, at least in the draft version of what we have, has some cost questions. Having not heard that presentation, I don't want to misspeak. What do you want to say about that? And then Rich, your last point about, do we need to be clear about the role of electrification in the thermal sector? That's what I'm hearing you say.
That's correct.
Yeah.
It's easy enough to change the names of the bullets. The problem is that the bullets come from specific things that were created in buckets.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that the cross-sector mitigation committee would want to make sure that we connect up the suite of policies that support both emission reduction and bill savings and associated benefits from all the buildings policies. So just want to make sure that doesn't get lost. And
okay. Counselors, as you're listening to this, does this seem like something that warrants, like, we want to do some edits to this document, or is it more like, helpful context as we're finalizing the executive summary and all that kind of stuff? Like, I'm curious what to do with these comments concretely as we move into finalization here. Any thoughts? Okay. Let me open it up also.
David has his hand up.
Sorry,
Oh, sorry. I can't see that.
For a minute because I couldn't find the
Gotcha.
icon. I wanted to share, this will speak to maybe perhaps how shallow I am, but I am thinking like we've got this expert, group of folks that presented a set of modeling results. It is what it is. I'm sure that there's ways in which it will be improved, but given the timing of where we are, I'm just not imagining that it does much more than provide context, at least speaking for myself, that, kind of where we're headed with these recommendations is the most important piece.
And I also don't want to diminish the important discussions that happened earlier about the kind of the language that we're using to describe the context for these recommendations. Also important, but I feel like really the focus needs to be on getting these things across this set of recommendations across the finish line in some manner that's digestible for policymakers. And I'm hoping we're not going to get sidetracked into a significant amount of debate or discussion about the 2030 versus 2035 and or whether the modeling is correct or whether there's some issues or areas from which it could be improved. So just my own editorial perspective.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. So before we switch gears to talk about next steps, I do want to like open it up, like the document that got circulated around over the weekend that I just showed briefly on the screen is the operating document for your priority actions, both top 10, top 52. If there are pending things or you don't like the way adjustments were made on the back end of a meeting, the last meeting, or we didn't do a good job of incorporating the comments from last meeting, this is a really good time to put those concerns on the table. Jared?
Sorry, before we leave the modeling conversation, I just want to raise something that I think is important and make sure my recollection is correct. I put this in the chat, but when we had a previous presentation from SEI, my recollection was that included in the economic analysis and the benefit cost analysis, I seem to recall an answer that the modeled health costs and benefits were not included in that overall analysis. And they had said that it was possible to include that. And I think that there was support for doing that so that we have a more kind of inclusive and holistic presentation of costs and benefits. And just it was reflecting on the weatherization conversation. I know that many of the modeled benefits of weatherization, going back to Shayla's comments and Will's, result from health cost savings of improved comfort and health of homes. And so I want to see if that recollection is A, correct, and B, if it is, if there are plans to do that, even if it's just a sensitivity, that adding in of the accounting of modeled health costs and benefits related to these measures, because I think that that is an important component and leaving it out could be problematic.
I think Jane typed in the chat, that's correct. SEI folks, anything else you want to say about that?
Just jumping in for just a second. I really appreciate that, Jared. And there's some nascent information that is starting to get greater attention in outward-facing presentations. Jeff Wilcox has assembled some information on weatherization health that's made the rounds, and we recently presented to the CAP agency network for some of the impacts associated with mental health as well as physical health, which are mostly anecdotal, with a lot of stories and information coming from the years of work that we've done across the network across the state. So I think that's a really important point. Another one I would just make really quickly is that a lot of these measures are based on projections that may go one way or another in terms of the implementation pace and effectiveness. And with weatherization, we have a real longitudinal record of what the actual impact is based on a known scale, which is a rather unique thing for us to be both recommending and thinking about our confidence of our analysis. So a point I wouldn't want to get lost in that process as well.
Yes, I would. David, you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I was going to say Jane.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would invite SEI. Last week there was a working session where SEI and our staff, but I was not there, sort of dove deep into the questions and comments from the June 2nd council meeting, as well as talked about where we're going. So Jared is right that those costs are not included, but I don't understand or expect that we have made any plans around doing a sensitivity to add those costs. So I just wanted SEI or Brian to confirm if I'm out of the loop on that right now.
Yes, I'll just quickly chime in here. So you're correct, Jared, that those are not currently included in the model. It is possible to include them. It is part of the capabilities of the software, but I think at the moment that is out of the scope of what we're trying to do. But we could discuss further with Brian on that.
Great. Okay, thanks. All right. So I'd love to talk about next steps, unless before we do, any last comments about how this major document's coming together with your priority actions? Any last comments about that? Okay, great. I hope the silence is, yeah, you know what, it's coming together. It's not like, ugh, I hate this document. I can't talk about it anymore. So let's see what it, that's my hope. Let's talk about next steps. Jane, you have a nice slide. Maybe you have it handy. I don't. That has all our next meetings and what we're trying to do. And while Jane pulls that up, we have 2 more meetings. Both of them are virtual. Next Monday and the following. And this is what we're trying to do. We've got a whole bunch of new chapters that are probably, as Jane signaled, are going to come in just under the wire. So expect another, Monday morning read session. So we'll be going through all those.
I'll just say, David, maybe just for folks, no, the definitions, acronyms, council acknowledgements, land acknowledgement, public engagement chapter, and rulemaking and legislative action will all actually can be posted in the next day or so, because some of those are chapters, some of them are tables, but those are all largely done. It's really just 3 chapters, the executive summary, the scientific underpinning chapter, which that's inaccurate on the slide. The scientific underpinning chapter was a chapter that I believe, Jared, you took the first shot at, but we're now trying in an attempt to merge that chapter, because that chapter really represented scientific underpinning of emissions reductions work, like the social cost of carbon and the greenhouse gas inventory. We're trying to merge that into one chapter with the modeling analysis. So that, I forget what the new title for that chapter is. Liz might know offhand, but that new chapter, the executive summary, and the letter from the council are really the 3 new pieces of work just to try to scale back how big this looks for next week. Those are 3 brand new things that will probably not come in until Friday. But the other pieces, we'll all either put them online or have them referenced correctly in the next day or so. So those you'll have plenty of time with.
That's really helpful, Jane. Thank you. So that's what our job is, to sort of do with all this, look through all this other text, make sure folks are feeling comfortable. And I think one of the things Jane and I need to work on is when we're going to post sort of the package of things that you are, quote, adopting on June 23rd. And so I'm not sure, Jane, you and I have finally landed on what that looks like, but it feels like we need to get that up online with some anticipation. Whatever edits come out of June 16th, a fast turnaround, and then all that sort of gets posted online as a packet, as the quote unquote plan. But Jane, I don't know if you have that clear in your mind right now.
No, we finally did put a nice, Sophie helped us at the end of last week with Liz, put a page online that really puts all the chapters in order. And we've been doing it, and we'll continue to update those as sort of the running list of the actual chapters in order as they're being updated. So that is the page, and hopefully Liz could maybe, while I'm talking, drop that in the chat. That is the page online that is keeping the updated draft relevant for the public, for all of you. And that is where you should be looking for the most recent drafts. All of these meetings have the current drafts and edits posed as public documents for these meetings, but the website now is sort of the living draft, and that will be updated as chapters assimilate new edits and are revised. So Liz is hopefully putting that in the chat. And then as far as like us, like PDFing it and putting it all in one place, David and I have a work planning session this week to sort of talk about who's on first for what between now and June 23rd. So our hope is that it'll be put all together with plenty of time, and those drafts are all being reviewed as they're coming in so that the reading of the whole thing won't feel so overwhelming. But we do have this week buffer. We're striving for June 23rd, and I'm really hopeful it's June 23rd, but we always have extra time if we need it and after that.
Okay. All right. Super. Great, folks. So you can see when you click on that website, boy, it really drives home the volume of what we're doing here. And so I thank everyone for sticking with it and really doing the thoughtful reads that you've been doing. I don't think I have anything else to say. Any other lingering questions or comments or concerns before we finish up today?
Dave, this is Carrick. I just
Carrick, you're breaking up on us. You might need to pause. It's a little hilly in Vermont. Makes for cell phone service not great. Carrick, you broke up on us.
Work's frozen, so.
Okay. Anyone else with any last things before we finish up today? Okay. All right, folks. Some of you know I've got thoughts on how to work with you in the next couple of days to revisions. Carrick, unfortunately, your line is just too choppy. Oh, that's really frustrating. Poor guy. All right. I think that's it, folks. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next week. Same time, same place. Take care.